welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Laura Getman. I'm the chair of the Faculty Professional Development, but we also get to procure the lecture series for Galveston College. We're really excited tonight to have Dr. Hal Needham here, and otherwise known as Hurricane Hal, which is how I first learned of him moving here 13 years ago. But I would like to introduce him to you as the Director of Extreme Weather and Disaster Science at GeoTrek, where he specializes in data-driven risk analysis for disaster-prone communities. He's conducted field work with 23 hurricanes and tropical storms, dozens of hail-producing thunderstorms, extreme winter environments with heavy snow loads and cold temperatures, extreme rainfall events in multiple states, and international field work ranging from hurricanes in Mexico to earthquakes in Greece and Morocco. Dr. Needham is the architect and developer of USurge, the world's most comprehensive storm surge database, and he hosts the GeoTrek podcast, a top-rated podcast on the topic of natural disasters. So let's welcome him up here for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks so much for everyone coming out tonight. So let's start with a woman named Daisy Thorne. Daisy Thorne is a 23-year-old school teacher in Galveston in the year 1900. So Daisy loved to swim in the Gulf, but her fair skin required her to swim during the evenings because she couldn't handle the intense sun that we have here during midday. So Daisy went down to the Gulf Coast on September 7th, 1900 for her evening swim, and she noticed these strange, large waves coming in from an unexplainable source, and so she decided it's a little rough to swim tonight. I'm going to go back home, come back down tomorrow, but she never went swimming tomorrow because when she went back home to her home at Lucas Terrace, and this is kind of catty corner from where McDonald's Seawall is today, massive stone and brick building with 64 rooms. She went in there, that's where she lived with her family. But when she woke up on the morning of September 8, 1900, that fateful day of the great Galveston hurricane, they were shocked to see in the morning the water was already up to Lucas Terrace. They hadn't really seen anything like that before. By early afternoon, waves were pounding into the side of Lucas Terrace. Daisy and her family took shelter in one interior room, and they were horrified in the late afternoon to see a massive wave strike the building, and a portion of Lucas Terrace fell off into the Gulf with the neighbors inside it. As they huddled into this one room for survival, as wave after wave after wave was obliterating Lucas Terrace, they became convinced that there was no way they were going to survive this storm. And so if you can imagine the next morning, their shock when they woke up. September 9th, 1900 was a beautiful morning, but when they woke up, this is all that was left of Lucas Terrace. Of the 64 rooms, only one room survived, and as fate would have it, it was actually the room that Daisy and her family were taking refuge in. And it's strange, it wasn't one of the lowest rooms, it wasn't one of the upper rooms, it was just a random room on the second floor. This picture here with Daisy's handwriting annotating where her bedroom was. Again, one room survived out of 64, and it was a room with Daisy and her family. One of the greatest survival stories you will ever hear. How can a storm be so powerful that it just obliterates massive stone buildings along the coast? What can we learn about these storms when we look back into Galveston's history? And most importantly, as we look ahead to Galveston's future, what can we learn about these storms and how can we be better prepared? Well, hey everyone, I'm Hurricane Hal. Really excited to be here tonight. I'm Director of Extreme Weather and Disaster Science at GeoTrek. I've been a Galveston resident for 10 years. I travel the country talking about extreme storms, and I'm so excited to do it right here in my home zip code. So exciting, great turnout tonight. Special thanks to Galveston College for hosting this lecture series. I know what stands out to me about Galveston College is just how engaged you are with the community. So special thanks for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. We're going to talk a lot about hurricanes tonight, really from a broad level into talking about specific risks for wind and flooding, and at the end we'll take some questions. So let's talk about hurricanes. The generic term for a hurricane is a tropical cyclone. Here in the Atlantic Basin, we call them hurricanes. Eastern Pacific, if you go to Hawaii or Mexico, they also call them hurricanes. Go to East Asia, they call them typhoons, but it's the same thing. It's a tropical cyclone. It's basically a massive heat engine that's sucking energy from warm salt water. And as the pressures fall in the center of a hurricane, it's sucking air towards the middle. Wind blowing across the curved surface of the earth causes rotation. In the northern hemisphere, hurricanes rotate counterclockwise. They go the opposite direction than the southern hemisphere. But really what we get on a satellite presentation, the most distinctive part of a hurricane is that eye, that relatively clear donut-shaped circle in the middle. And an eye, actually, you can have sunshine, the winds are relatively light. This was an image of Hurricane Dorian, Category 5 hurricane in the Bahamas, 2019. Hurricane Katrina, 2005. And you can see where the eye is located. Again, you can actually have the sunshine sometimes in an eye. As far as I know, I'm the only human being on the planet. Well, there's another guy in Mexico, the two of us. When I was in the eye of Hurricane Grace in Mexico, I brought my Frisbee with me. I love playing Frisbee, and I was curious, can you complete a Frisbee pass in the eye of a hurricane? This guy thought it was crazy, my friend that I was riding it out with, but we did it. So the winds typically in the eye, they can be calm. More often, they might be 5 to 10 miles an hour, just like a typical day in Galveston. But around the eye, you have this ring of extremely intense storms. You can have lightning and thunder, but just this sustained wind is just deafening. That's called the eye wall. And that's really where most of the action takes place in a hurricane is the eye wall, where you get tremendously strong winds. So let's talk about this hurricane wind. We've all experienced incredibly strong winds in a thunderstorm that may last for a minute or two, maybe 5 minutes. The thing that surprises people about hurricanes is you might get those really intense winds for 6 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours. It feels like it's never going to end. As the pressures drop in a hurricane, it's sucking more air towards the middle. The winds start to increase. And this is just a little bit about wind classification. Once those winds top 39 miles an hour sustained, so that's a sustained wind lasting at least 2 minutes, we call it a tropical storm, and it gets a name. We've been naming hurricanes since 1950. Before that, the storms were unnamed. Now we name storms, starting at the beginning of the alphabet, going to the end. And once those winds increase to 74 miles an hour, it becomes a hurricane. At 74 miles an hour, a Cat 1 hurricane, we have a category system on a scale of 1 to 5. The higher the number, the stronger the winds. And I wanted to mention these numbers, why 74 miles an hour? Why not 70? Why not 80? Structural engineers have actually put this scale system together. And what they noticed was at these different thresholds, with a 5 being stronger than a 4 and so forth, you start seeing substantially more damage as you go up the category system. So categories 1 and 2, you can start to see substantial wind damage on buildings. But once you hit category 3, and you have sustained winds of at least 111 miles an hour, you start seeing major damage to even well-built buildings. That's what we call major hurricanes, category 3, category 4, category 5. As was mentioned in the introduction, I've either lived through or done field work in 23 hurricanes and tropical storms. I've seen a lot of damage, and I'll tell you, you can really see these thresholds of wind damage as you go up the category system. We're going to start the talk tonight by talking about wind. This is a photograph I took from Hurricane Sally, 2020 in Alabama. And this is typical Category 1 hurricane damage, where you're seeing damage to the roof. The walls in general are intact, but you can start to see a lot of trees down and damage to roof. Boy, you jump up to Cat 3 and things start to change in a hurry. This is Hurricane Laura, 2020. This was Cat 3 to Cat 4 winds in the southern part of Lake Charles, Louisiana. You can just see tremendous damage there. Telephone poles, much of the roof is gone on that church. This is, more photographs of Hurricane Laura in South Louisiana, 2020. At one point, the Euro model, which many people will say is the most accurate weather model on Earth, put Laura coming right over Galveston Island as a Cat 4, and it just didn't quite happen. We were very fortunate. It curved to the right, but when it hit South Louisiana, that area near Cameron, they had sustained winds of 150, far beyond what we've ever seen here in Galveston. And the next year, they had Hurricane Ida in southeast Louisiana, also sustained winds of 150. They had back-to-back hurricanes that were almost Cat 5, 2020, 2021. We didn't feel any of that over here, but boy, it was in the neighborhood, and it was a close call. This also, Hurricane Laura, 2020. And you're starting to see really wall failure, roof failure. A lot of things start happening in Category 3, Category 4 hurricanes. Category 5, I've been on the ground in doing field work in 2 Cat 5s. Alicia, my wife, was there in Mexico after Hurricane Otis. It's hard to even explain the things you're seeing when there's a Cat 5. This had sustained winds of 165. This is a high-rise where whole floors are stripped. Typically, you say, get to an interior room. When sustained winds are 165, all that's left of some of those floors is an elevator shaft. Unfortunately, this hurricane back in 2023 was not well forecast at all. They had never seen anything like this in the Acapulco area, and there was almost no evacuation. So these buildings were occupied when the storm hit. A very horrific storm, and it was just mind-boggling. You're seeing things that your brain doesn't really register what you're seeing with your eyes. So back closer to home, what are the strongest hurricane winds we've ever seen here on record in Galveston? Well, we go back to the storm in 1900, September 8th, 1900, the 1900 storm. It was a Category 4 hurricane. So the max winds are classified as 120 knots, which is around 138 miles an hour. Fairly compact hurricane, and I think really the core of it went in down by Jamaica Beach, maybe the airport, really just south of the seawall. Galveston City, officially, we have this record of 120 mile an hour winds. But this is interesting. Well, how do we know it was 120? So we actually have the longest continuous weather records here in Galveston, west of the Mississippi River. We've had the Weather Bureau, which is now the National Weather Service, here in Galveston since 1871. At the time of the 1900 storm, the U.S. Weather Bureau was, if you're familiar with Proletariat Public House at 23rd and Market, that was an old department store, but the Weather Bureau was on the 3rd floor. They had instruments on the roof. And how many people here have read the book Isaac Storm? Okay, quite a few of you. It's about Isaac Klein, the chief meteorologist at the time of the 1900 storm. He and his brother Joseph worked in the Weather Bureau, but there was another observer named John Blagden who was at the instruments the night of the storm, and his son actually wrote this letter to the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1991 from Bangor, Maine. And he said, enclosed are some pictures of the 1900 flood for your city. I thought you might like to have them. My father was an observer there at the time of the flood. He told us that he was looking at the anemometer, the wind gauge. He was looking at the anemometer gauge when it was carried away at 120 miles an hour. So imagine you're sitting at the controls, 3rd floor of the Levy building. You're watching the wind go up through the 60s and 70s, and all of a sudden it's 98, and it's 108, and all of a sudden it gets to 120, and then it goes to 0 because the anemometer's gone, it just blew off the roof. So we don't really know exactly how high the wind speeds were in the 1900 storm, but I'll tell you from my field work and looking at these pictures of what happened in Galveston in 1900, again at Cat 3, 111 miles an hour, you start seeing spectacular failure of buildings. And you look at these pictures of the 1900 storm, Bath Avenue School. The most iconic would be Sacred Heart Church at 14th and Broadway across the street from Bishop's Palace. I mean, look at this, the whole roof and much of the side of the building are completely sheared off. I mean, this is tremendous winds. And, you know, looking at these pictures, I really think that it's more probable that the sustained winds in Galveston were probably in the 130s. I mean, this looks well beyond the threshold of a Cat 3 hurricane. It looks more like a Cat 4 hurricane wind damage to me. I think most likely the sustained winds were probably in the 130s. I think that, that we're going to have to adjust that when we look back at our hurricane winds for the 1900 storm. It was a vicious storm, and I think the winds in Galveston might have looked something like this. Now, I'm not the most tech-savvy person. I have a video clip I'm going to try to pull up if I can pull it off. Let's see if I can do this here. This might actually work. Let's see if you can see this. Okay, this is actually going to work. This is a video. I'm sorry that it's so thin, but it's the best I can do. Check this out. So I filmed this actually in Category 4 Hurricane Ian back in 2022. I'm going to grab my water here. But this is not filtered, this is not AI generated. I filmed these winds, and these are brutal winds. These winds are probably, I was with a very seasoned hurricane chaser who thought these winds were sustained probably 130 to 135. Those winds in Ian, it felt like it was never going to end. It was this intense, this was the eye wall, but we were taking hurricane force winds for about 10 to 12 hours. I was with some tornado chasers that said, do these things ever end? I mean, the eastern tornado goes through in 10 minutes. This was just incredibly long, but I think looking at this, I think this is what it might have looked like in Galveston during the 1900 storm. I'll go back to the presentation here, but I just wanted to share those videos. By the way, people say, how in the world do I film things like that? Well, I like to get on the ground early, and I like parking garages, actually. They get me up above the floodwater. That's the big concern when you chase hurricanes. And you can also, on a parking garage, you get a 360-degree view. So, so again, massive wind event, 1900 storm. We've had a lot of hurricanes in Galveston's history. But incidentally, if you say, man, I wish I could have seen what Sacred Heart Church looked like, because it's been rebuilt since the 1900 storm, but the new building, it did not match the old. In other words, they did not just reconstruct what was previously there. You can actually time travel and go to Augusta, Georgia, and see a replica Sacred Heart Church from Galveston in 1900. What happens was Nicholas Clayton, the premier, one of the most famous architects in Galveston's history, he built this with an assistant. The assistant, unauthorized, took these blueprints of this church to Augusta, Georgia, and built a replica church in Augusta that was not authorized, and it got ugly. I believe there was a lawsuit involved. When I was doing field work at Hurricane Debbie a few years ago, I passed through Augusta. I was like, I have to see Sacred Heart Church, because this is what it looked like in Galveston going back before the 1900 storm. Almost an exact replica to the inch. And so going inside, seeing how incredibly ornate it was, and knowing the history here, I don't know how many fatalities were in Sacred Heart Church in 1900, but it's well documented that about 400 people took refuge inside. And again, as the roof collapsed and the building disintegrated around them, I'd say most probably there were fatalities inside. But again, imagining 400 people crowded in this space as the roof and the walls give way. It was really a powerful moment to be there in Augusta, Georgia, picturing this is exactly what it looked like in Galveston in 1900. So how often should we expect hurricane force winds in Galveston? When I did my doctoral research at Louisiana State University, my major professor, Barry Pine, he did this study where he basically went back into all the hurricane climate records, and they retracked all the hurricanes to come up with what we call return periods. How often should you expect tropical storm force winds, hurricane storm force winds, or even Category 3 or above hurricanes? And what they found looking at Galveston, city number 4 there, on average, this is taking data from 1900 to, from 1901 to 1905. So it's a 105-year study. They found on average every 3 years we have a tropical storm strike. Every 8 years we're impacted by a hurricane. And every 26 years we're impacted by a major hurricane. Now you might say when you look at this, hang on a second, why are we so much more risky than city number 3 and city number 5? Places like Southwest Louisiana, why are they so much less risky than we are? Even in a 105-year data set, you see a lot of randomness and clustering. If this ran out for 500 years, it would really smooth out. As we know, over the past 20 years, South Louisiana has been hit by a lot of hurricanes. So this would actually smooth out over time, but it's a general perspective of looking at our region, at our neighborhood, and seeing how vulnerable we are to hurricanes. A hurricane impact every 8 years, major hurricane every 26 years. We get a lot of impacts in this part of the world, and hurricanes are a big deal. So that was really an interesting study, and again, this will smooth out over time. This is a disturbing trend that we've seen over the past 9 years. We've had 7 hurricanes rapidly intensify right before landfall. What I mean by that is the wind speeds increased by at least 40 miles an hour in that last day before landfall. It's happened 7 times in the past 9 years. For context, it's only happened 12 times since 1950, but 7 of those, the ones with the yellow stars here, have happened in the past 7 years. So we've had this trend of these very rapidly intensifying hurricanes over the past decade or so, and this has a huge impact for hurricane response. If you run a hospital, oil or gas facility, a college or university, you have plans even for residents. We have plans of how we're going to prepare for a hurricane. For our facilities, often the plans say 72 hours before landfall, do this. 24 hours before landfall, do that. What if these storms don't give us that much time? And that's what we're seeing. A lot of these storms blowing up right before landfall. Quick story of an impact of that. When I was in South Louisiana covering Hurricane Ida, I was on the ground the day before, actually right after landfall. I met this couple they lived in the western part of Metro New Orleans in a place called Laplace. And they were terrified. You can see that there's a high water mark here in their garage. As water rushed in, they thought they were going to drown. They pulled down the stairs to their attic and they took refuge in the attic underneath their roof. Now you can do that if it's a big rain event. But this storm was producing Category 3 winds in their area. This is one of their neighbors' houses, roof completely gone. You do not want to be taking refuge from this storm in your attic. But when I was talking to them, they said, why were there no evacuation orders? And this blew my mind. This was Hurricane Ida 5 years ago. I thought up to Ida, if conditions are sufficiently dangerous that the wind or water could kill people, they're going to issue an evacuation. That's not true. In a case of Ida, they did not have enough time to get everyone out. So I'm not criticizing emergency managers, but they were left with a tough choice. Do we issue a mandatory evacuation and everyone's not going to be out? When this storm hits, thousands of people are going to be stuck in gridlock. Do we issue that evacuation order, or do we make believe this storm's not there? Again, I'm not criticizing them, it's just a really tough call to make. I was driving around the day before this Category 4 hurricane came in, and this is what I saw. Emergency message signs said, seatbelts, vaccinations, both save lives. Nothing about the Cat 4 hurricane coming in, because they just decided we need 72 hours to evacuate, and we don't have it. It went from a Cat 1 to a Cat 4 right before landfall. So South Florida, Metro New Orleans, Houston, Galveston corridor, the three big urban areas where you need at least 48 hours to do an evacuation. Last year we saw some of the local guidance shifted to where we were going to try to give us 72 hours if possible. But if you spend any time on Galveston Island, you know we have 3 lanes out of here in the main route with no shoulder, and we can get a disabled car on the causeway on a Tuesday morning. Any random Tuesday, you could be backed up for an hour. Imagine evacuation traffic and the nightmare that would be if we had a rapidly intensifying hurricane. I'm not trying to be sensational, I'm not trying to hype things up, but this is a big concern that we've seen these rapidly intensifying hurricanes. We need to be more vigilant than ever. If we need to evacuate, we need to be able to do it quickly and get out of harm's way pretty quickly. In part, why we're seeing so many of these rapidly intensifying hurricanes is just very warm sea surface temperatures in the Gulf. This is a map from just last week of the sea surface temperature anomalies, how much warmer than normal the water temps are. And we have reason to believe that, especially in the last few decades, we've had unusually warm water in the Gulf that may be giving more fuel to these hurricanes. So if hurricane wind was not enough to worry about, in this part of the world we also deal with something called storm surge, this massive wall of salt water that pushes on shore in a hurricane. This is what a storm surge looks like. This is the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926. You can see the tops of palm trees sticking out of the salt water. And of course, most of the damage, unfortunately, most of the fatalities from the 1900 storm were really caused by the effects of water. What we saw before with Lucas Terrace, this is a photograph from around 12th Street, I believe, in Galveston during the 1900 storm, where this is the power of water to really destroy everything in its path. So for a long time, hurricane scientists reason the stronger the winds, the higher the storm surge is going to be. And so we actually have signage out on the landscape that attests to this. This is actually the parking garage over by 20th Street, 20th and Ball, and you can see that you can see water levels for Category 3, Category 4, Category 5. What I love about this is we're getting signage out on the landscape that people can see. What I don't love about this is we found along the way that this does not really align with the real world. So does anyone remember what category Hurricane Ike was back in 2008? Yeah, it was a 2, right? So if you're looking at this image, you say, well, okay, Category 2, Ike's water level should be here in red, right? The problem is, here in Galveston, the water level came more in yellow. And if you go across the bay to Bolivar Peninsula, the water level before you got to the massive destructive waves on top of the storm surge was in blue. And this left a lot of people wondering, how in the world can a Category 2 hurricane produce a Category 4 surge? And it wasn't just an academic exercise. Unfortunately, this was a very fatal hurricane. We look at the photographs from Crystal Beach, Rollover Pass, these areas on Bolivar Peninsula were completely wiped clean. And the public started saying, how in the world can this be a 2 on a scale of 1 to 5? I mean, this is completely apocalyptic. You could not have survived this. We saw what it looked like in Bolivar Peninsula. We saw a tremendous amount of debris in Galveston seawall. About 90% of Galveston city flooded. And again, it led people to saying, how in the world can this be a 2 on a scale of 1 to 5? Well, it turns out that Ike geographically was enormous. The scale system only tells you about your maximum sustained winds. It doesn't tell you anything about the geographic size of the hurricane. Ike was enormous, and so a geographically huge Category 2 is pushing a lot more salt water than a geographically small Category 2 hurricane. I love that you could go down and really see our high water history down on Post Office Street at Tequilos. And this is really interesting when you look at these high water marks. Downtown, Ike is king. Ike is the highest watermark we've had, at least downtown. followed by 1915, the 1900 storm, Carla from 1961, and Alicia from 1983. And what's interesting about this is the lowest category hurricane produced the highest water. And so how many times have you heard your friends and neighbors say, I only evacuate for Cat 3 or above? And what their meaning is, I don't evacuate every time there's a little, hurricane scare, just the big ones. But the problem is the category system doesn't really match up with the water levels. And so if you decide you're staying because it's only a Cat 2, you can be drowning in your house. And this is the problem. We have wind, storm surge, and heavy rainfall, 3 major hazards that hurricanes give, but we classify them with one number. One number can't describe 3 different hazards. So there's all kinds of miscommunication with this. By the way, if you're looking at this and you're like, wow, this is surprising. So Ike was the highest high water mark we ever had. Galveston has very localized flood history. And so if you were to take the highest high water mark that ever happened anywhere in this yellow circle, and I run the U.S. Coastal Flood Database, and this is actually all of the high water marks in Galveston that I put together over the last 208 years. I need to get a life. My wife will look over at 11:30 and be like, what, you're doing more hurricane stuff? Come on, it's Saturday night, what are we doing here? But it's exciting stuff, 208 years of history. I built the first storm surge database for the Philippines, Australia, India, Bangladesh. We have no more data for anywhere in the world than Galveston, Texas, and Atlantic City, New Jersey. They both have very long records. We know a lot of what's happened here. On the island as a whole, 1900 storm is king. Ike is a little bit lower, but during 1900, there was a massive debris dam that went down around 12th Street and around Avenue N. And so it basically formed this massive horseshoe of debris that was 20 feet high. So if you were in downtown Galveston the night of the 1900 storm, a lot of that salt water was dammed up. So 1900 storm is actually in 3rd place downtown. On the island as a whole, though, it's the number 1. So again, this is really interesting, though. I've actually converted to all of these high water marks are converted to the same system you use if you get your home elevation. Like if you get an elevation certificate for your home, if your home's at 11 feet, we can see that you probably flooded 3 times in your home's history over the last 208 years. So we're actually moving towards address-based flood forecasting where we can see how many times a given building has flooded, and we know all of our history here. Yeah, good question.
Where do you get that certificate from?
Where do you get that certificate? There are different places that you can get surveyors come out and do an elevation certificate and actually tell you exactly how high you are. And it can help. It can really help sometimes with your insurance rates and things like that. We can talk a little bit more about that at the end. So back to storm surge, we talked about again the category system. It just tells you your maximum sustained wind speeds, but there are really 5 factors that influence storm surge. The maximum sustained wind speed, especially before it hits the coast, the storm size, the geographic size is important, the storm forward speed, and also, so those 3 things really have to do with the storm. But there are 2 characteristics that don't have anything to do with the storm. The water depth of your coast, the bathymetry, and also the coastal shape. And so it's funny because you go to Galveston Beach and you look out and the horizon looks flat, right? But what's going on underneath the water really affects storm surge quite a bit. And where we have shallow water, or what we call bathymetry, where we have shallow water, the storm surge tends to be a lot higher. You can see here on this map, the orange, the reds are shallow water. We have a lot of shallow water here off the coast of Texas. By contrast, if you look off the coast of southeast Florida, it gets very deep very quickly. Where you have shallow water, you get higher storm surges. So if a Cat 4 hurricane of an average size were to hit us, we might get a 15-foot storm surge. In 1992, a Cat 4 hurricane hit Hawaii. They only had a 6-foot storm surge. So again, if you've been to Hawaii, it's volcanic. It gets very deep very quickly, so your storm surges are a lot less. These are the top 10 storm surges in U.S. history since 1900. And you can see 6 of them happened really between South Texas and Mississippi. Incidentally, the 1900 storm is not on that list. It was not high enough. The number 8 there is actually Ike, which was higher than the 1900 storm. So keep in mind, the 1900 storm is not even on that list. This is what I call a very dangerous neighborhood for storm surge. And when I built the global storm surge database, what I found were the storm surges in this area are really the 2nd highest in the world. Only in the Bay of Bengal, getting into India and Bangladesh, do you get really higher consistent storm surges than you get in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So we have more vulnerability and more risk than a lot of other places. So what can we expect this hurricane season? A lot of people asking what can we expect. We look at sea surface temperature to see how unusually warm or cool it is. We look out in the Atlantic at an area called MDR, or the main development region, where that tends to be warmer than normal. We tend to get more hurricanes in the Atlantic. That's been running warm since 1995, so it tends to run warm or cold for about 20 to 30 years at a time. The Pacific is actually what we call this area of the equatorial Pacific. When that's running warm, we call it El Nino, and it suppresses Atlantic hurricanes. When the equatorial Pacific is running cool, we call it La Nina, and that actually it creates more favorable conditions for Atlantic hurricanes. Right now, we're in February, March, April, and we're moving towards what we call a neutral. It's ENSO neutral. It's not El Nino. It's not La Nina. But moving towards the heart of hurricane season, August, September, October, we see a lot of red there. It means we'll be most likely in an El Nino. That tends to suppress hurricanes in the Atlantic. We get more wind shear, more hostile conditions for Atlantic hurricanes. However, there's one thing I wanted to point out on this, and this is an interesting factoid I recently came across. You know how it is in Texas, we're independent, we like to do our own thing, we like to be different than everyone else. We have a really weird signature. When we have the grays on this image, the ENSO neutral, we tend to get a lot of Texas hurricanes. So look at this. This is Texas hurricanes since 1950. We've never had one when we've been in El Nino. We've had 4 when we've been in La Nina, but 15 when we've been in ENSO neutral. So all the big ones you can think of, Carla, Rita, Alicia, Ike, Beryl, they all were ENSO neutral. And this is interesting. That's about 80% or 79% of our hurricanes have been ENSO neutral. Moving into the beginning of this hurricane season, say late May, June, July, August, I think we're going to be in ENSO neutral. It doesn't guarantee anything. We're rolling the dice every year by living in Galveston. I think with the Gulf running warm and us being in ENSO neutral for, say, June, July, August, we're just going to be rolling the dice a little more than normal this year. So hopefully there won't be any trouble. But if there was ever a year to be vigilant, this is a good year to really make sure that you're prepared. My close friend Phil Klotzbach, a close colleague of mine, he'll release the Atlantic seasonal forecast. He's really an expert on this. He'll release this from the National Tropical Weather Conference on April 9th. So as we close up tonight's talk, how do we take action? We've talked about our wind risk, we've talked about our flood risk. We know we have a high risk for hurricanes here along the upper Texas coast. What are some things we can do that are achievable and affordable to take action? And that's how we're going to close up the lecture tonight. So I'm going to go through these quickly. I'm going to give you short-term and long-term things you can do. Number one, almost every professional I know that works in disasters and catastrophes says take pictures and videos of your house every single year. New purchases, that big screen TV, that addition you added to your house, you're going to need to prove all of that if you have an insurance claim or if your home gets damaged by a hurricane. So take pictures and videos. That's a good place to start. Number two, having a plan to leave. What are you going to do if you evacuate? Where are you going to go? How are you going to prepare your home? The city of Galveston recommends if you do leave, be prepared to stay away for at least 2 weeks. We may not have services here if a big storm hits. And so having a checklist is really huge. Think through the things you need to do. So if you need to get out quickly, you have a checklist to go down. The next one, plan to stay. So what if we have, say, a glancing blow from a Cat 1 hurricane? You're not going to evacuate, but you may be 3 or 4 days without power. How are you going to live without power in the summer here in Galveston? What do you need to survive for those days? And some things you may need, non-perishable food, plenty of water. What about battery backups for your phone? You can get those at big box stores where you can charge your phone, 7 or 8 times for $30. Flashlights and headlamps are really important. A lot of us have been relying on smartphones that will drain your battery, and those lights are not nearly as good. Keep in mind, you may need to see in flooded conditions or see in your home in the middle of the night. You definitely want a good flashlight. What about generators, Starlink internet, some of these other technologies? Whatever you have, my recommendation would be to try it out or test it ahead of time. So if you have a generator, have you used it? Was it a Christmas gift and it's been sitting in a box and you've never actually put it together? If you need, say, an adapter or a plug or something like that, you can go to the hardware store and complete that task in a half an hour. But if it's the day before a hurricane hits, they're going to be crowded or closed, and some of these easy tasks to service a generator, for example, become hard or impossible. So now's the time to do all that. Whether you go or stay, these are 5 things I would recommend you definitely have. Cash. Cash is so underrated, even if you don't leave. If you stay in Galveston and we get a tropical storm, you don't even leave, and we lose power for 2 days. Finally, the power's back on, you go to Kroger or Walmart, and they say, oh, our card readers are down because we lost power, we're taking only cash. Oh gosh, I only have $11 to my name. Well, I'll go to the ATM. Oh, They don't have any cash there because 25 other people did the same thing. So all of a sudden, having cash is really important. Filling your medication. We talked about getting out quickly if our storm rapidly intensifies. Every hour is crucial. You don't want to spend 3 hours in a huge line at Walgreens because you let your medication get down to the last pill. So staying ahead of all these things is really important. Having your papers, your ID, your passport, your insurance in a Ziploc bag or a waterproof tub. Non-perishable food and water, even if you're leaving. Say you're evacuating and you get in evacuation traffic. It's going to be really nice to have, granola bars or cans of soup with you in the vehicle so you don't have to fight really, really long lines at convenience stores on the way out. So short-term prep, we always hear about that. What we don't hear a lot about is long-term prep. I'm going to talk about these things real quickly. Here are 5 things that you can look into. One is called Fortify. This is an optional voluntary program where you can decide to build above code. They'll actually have a third-party inspector that verifies that you built to the fortified standard. Now here in Texas, again, we're independent. A lot of folks are saying, hey man, don't bring me your program from Washington, D.C. Check this out, Fortify comes from South Alabama. They're Gulf Coast friends. They have over 18,000 fortified homes in South Alabama. When I documented Category 2 Hurricane Sally, this path of Sally went right through fortified country there in South Alabama. This was a slow-moving hurricane, only moving at 2 miles an hour with 105-mile-an-hour sustained winds. It tore up South Alabama, but it did not tear up the fortified homes. Over 95% of fortified homes saw little damage. So imagine you evacuate, you come back home, your neighbor's roofs are off, but you just go right back in your house because you built to a better code. Again, that's something you can look into with Fortified. It's a big deal in other places of the Gulf Coast. And I hope it catches on here in Texas. It would be great to see us better prepared. I love this website. This is Flash, Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. You can go to this website, flash.org, and you can pull down the menu for perils at the top. You select hurricanes, and it will walk you through all of these things you can do to better prepare your home or business. Strengthening your soffits, installing clips or straps, protecting your windows, protecting your appliances, strengthening your garage door. You can go everywhere from high-end commercial to do it yourself. If you want to strengthen your garage door and your budget's $150, they have braces that you can do that yourself. They'll actually walk you through adaptations you can make to your home or business. Again, that's flash.org, and you can just pull down whatever peril and they'll walk you through different options to mitigate and better prepare your home. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, what about ClimaGuard? This is where it gets interesting. How about a waterproof bag for your car that you can just drive your car in and zip it up, or your piano, or your family photos, or your books, or all the things you can't take with you when you evacuate. This is really an innovative product. So if you want to look into flooding, go down to Hertz Lake, right? It's flooding there, it seems like all the time. My wife and I had a ClimaGuard bag, and a couple years ago we thought, let's go and bless someone. So we drove down to Hertz Lane when there was a storm coming. We found this woman named Doris, and I thought, she's going to think I'm nuts. And I said, I have this waterproof bag. I'd like to zip up your car and help save it. And she said, I think that sounds like an amazing idea. So we did it, and there's Alicia. She's right here tonight. There's Alicia rolling out the waterproof bag. There's the salt water already coming into her yard. And we literally wrapped up her car. I'm not super mechanical. We did this in about 8 minutes. People have asked me, what about the canopy? I'm like, I don't know, it was already there. It's an academy, it has nothing to do with ClimaGuard. I have no idea why she had an canopy out there, but she did. But the bag is ClimaGuard, and Doris was taking pictures through the storm. She said the water got a lot higher than this, and she thinks her car would have flooded if she didn't have a ClimaGuard bag. It's like a $400 bag that, again, you can protect your car that it never floods again, or protect any of your possessions. Again, achievable, affordable. These are the types of things that we're looking for that, we can't stop these storms from coming, but how can we get out ahead of them to reduce the impacts? Elevating houses, that's more expensive, but depending on how this impacts your insurance. A lot of people are saying, hey, my flood insurance is crazy. This is a picture I took in New Jersey in October. You can elevate most houses, and so it's something to look into. It can actually, in some cases, really reduce your insurance, which may help pay for itself in the long run. And now, if you really want to get crazy, this is something near and dear to my heart. Some of you in this room know what I'm going to talk about. Floating houses, one of my favorite things to talk about. Buoyant foundations. Imagine if your house could float when it floods and never flood again. Imagine if your flood insurance could drop to $0 a year because you have a buoyant foundation. So This is an interesting idea. The leader or the head of the Buoyant Foundation project actually came to Galveston in 2016 and built a floating house in a tank over at the Sears building at 23rd and Broadway. So you have to do some adaptations if you have a floating house. You have to have pilings in the walls or guy wires so your house does not float down the street. You have to detach your electrical and detach your plumbing. But in theory, your house would never flood again. The engineering's there. They're doing it in parts of Southeast Asia and Central America. Policy is the big concern. There's a lot of pushback in the U.S. And I know when Elizabeth English launched this program, FEMA said not only will they not insure a floating house, but if any community adopts or gives approval of a floating house, they'll take the flood insurance away from the entire city. So there's a lot of opposition to this. But again, with risk increasing, with insurance increasing, with people saying, I can't afford to live in places like Galveston, I'm hoping we can have more creative dialogue where we look at innovations like this to say, you know, can we develop a flood resiliency industry that helps serve our community, and can we export that knowledge? Imagine 10 years from now, the front page of the New York Times, a hurricane hits Miami, and the buoyant block floated, and this was installed by a team out of Galveston, Texas. This is the kind of thing that we can, I think, grab onto these innovations to not only serve ourselves, but export that knowledge to serve other communities and build a business as well. Finally, if you're really into this resiliency stuff, you want to learn more about it, you can listen to podcasts. So I host the GeoTrek podcast. We tell stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. We cover wildfires, hurricanes, blizzards, you name it. It's a top-rated podcast on natural disasters. It's basically like a radio show, and I think you'll really enjoy the guests that are there. And if you want to get into more Galveston history and understand a deeper dive in our resiliency, check out Galveston Hurricane Tour. We have a popular community walking tour on Friday or Saturday evenings. We have these 2 dates in the spring. It's a lot of fun. We spend a few hours together, take a break for dinner. You can go to GalvestonHurricaneTour.com or just reach out to me. But we have 2 walking tours a day that we'd love to have you join. And it's just a lot of fun. And also, we've been having a lot of K-12 students and college and university students come on their hurricane tour as well. We have a special day tour for students that want to get out, learn more about our history, learn more about the science of extreme weather and how they can better prepare for hurricanes. So hopefully, I'm hoping more than anyone that we don't have any hurricane impacts this year. But if we do, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn more than anything, but if I'm actually going into storm zones, I post a lot of my footage on Instagram and X. And then this is my contact information. You can reach out to me anytime. But again, so much appreciate being here this evening. My hope is that Galveston continues to get better prepared and that we continue dialogue, community engagement like we're doing tonight. I always say you can't stop the storms from coming, but there are things we can do to mitigate and be better prepared so that when the next storm comes, we're better prepared. And again, a huge thank you to Galveston College for hosting this lecture and the entire lecture series, and for all the great work you're all doing to really engage with the local community. Thank you. All right, do we have a few minutes for questions?
Yes.
We have, okay, yeah, we have. That'd be fantastic. I love a little interaction. Yeah.
I'm interested in the building on the west end. I mean, they don't have a seawall. It seems like that's a more vulnerable situation.
Yeah, great question. The building on the west end where they don't have a seawall. That is a really great question. Obviously, the seawall runs about 10 miles. Where you get to the west end or you get out to Bolivar Peninsula, you don't have a seawall anymore. So that is a concern. Obviously, you get a lot more wave action. Actually, when I mentioned buoyant foundations, one reason it could work in Galveston City, buoyant foundations don't work where you have wave action. So they would not work out by Jamaica Beach. They would not work in Bolivar Peninsula. But there are different issues there that coastal engineering and geology really look at. One of the issues being when you get outside the seawall, 2 major differences. We don't have the seawall protection. We don't have an elevated ground. So here in Galveston, we built the seawall from 1902 to 1904 and then raised the elevation of the city. That's why we can have a lot of houses that aren't elevated much above ground level, but the ground is elevated. You get out to the west end, for example, the ground is not elevated. That's why all the houses are up. And one of the big concerns out there is the massive action of the waves on the dunes and just the wave and flood impact. So I know it is a concern. I know there's been talk about a coastal spine or the Ike Dike, basically increasing the elevation of the seawall where it is today and extending it farther down. I know there's been a lot of discussion like that, but as it is right now, that's why we see so many houses elevated out there, because the ground is low and the flood impact is really high. I think, and the question was, is it similar to Crystal Beach? Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. The flood risk is pretty extreme all throughout this part of the country. Ground elevations tend to be, I don't know, maybe 4 to 6 feet. If you go to Jamaica Beach, go to Crystal Beach, pretty similar. So pretty low-lying ground that if you had a hurricane in the neighborhood, it's going to definitely overwash the ground. And the concern there too is just when people think of floods, they often think of water rising vertically. With storm surge, it can move in like a raging river. And that could be the issue, could be a lot of wave action, a lot of high velocity water that does a lot of destruction down there. So that's in part why we have the buildings elevated so high out there. Great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you involved with evacuation programs for the broader Gulf Coast? We have, Houston area had a horrible experience with, I think it was Rita or something like that. I know there's been some changes. Still all of Galveston County and Harris County have to exit through 2 lanes on I-45 through downtown.
Yeah.
It's
a great question. The question is if I'm involved with evacuation planning on the regional level. I'm not formally, like as a consultant or working on those plans, maybe more as in an indirect way as a scientist seeing the risk of these different wind and flood hazards. I'm very concerned about the limited routes off of places like Galveston and for a lot of Galveston County. I mean, when you do the math, especially, you take a storm like Hurricane Beryl a few years ago that came in on the back end of 4th of July weekend. If that storm was a little farther north and a little stronger, how in the world are you going to get 200,000 people off Galveston Island quickly? And there's no way really to do it. So I am concerned for that. I think we need to look at creative options. How can we get more routes out of here? Or, what we need to consider as well, are there secondary plans to shelter people in place? And so my wife and I have talked about, if your house was on fire in the middle of the night, and you ran out in the street, and your house was gone, but you saved your life, you'd say, thank God, you got out immediately, right? With hurricanes, there's something that people are like, well, I only have 48 hours, you want to save all your stuff, and it takes people a long time. But there's, this mentality that the evacuation is a long process, and we know you're going to have the gridlock. I've been wondering if there should be more discussion about vertical evacuation, which basically would be, we have tons of hotels and high buildings here where we could actually have people shelter themselves to save their lives in a worst case scenario, where maybe we can't get all of the cars out. Real quickly, I was doing some field work in the country of Spain. There's a city called Chipiona. That's the only tsunami-ready city in Spain. So a tsunami is a massive coastal flood that comes in after an earthquake. When I told them that we struggle to get people off the island in 48 hours, the mayor and my friend I were talking to, they laughed. They said, you have 48 hours? They said, if we get hit by an earthquake, we have an hour. An hour. And they said, we've modeled it. We can move 100,000 people out of the flood zone in an hour. I said, there's no way. How in the world would you do that? He said, we're doing it. He said, there's no way we can do it in cars. They do pedestrian evacuation. They do have some hills, but they also have high buildings. They can get everyone out of the flood zone very quickly. This is something we really should be talking about here. What happens if we have a Hurricane Ida that hit New Orleans area and it blows up from a Cat 1 to a Cat 4 on 4th of July or Labor Day weekend? We should be talking about plans for vertical evacuation. I know it's unusual, it's unorthodox, but it could also save a lot of lives. So we have the capacity to save lives here, but we need to have foresight and talk about these unusual, unorthodox topics. We like to think as Americans we can do everything in a car. Evacuating hundreds of thousands of people very quickly is extremely difficult to do when you have maybe 2 routes. So that's really the concern that we have here, is we just don't have enough routes out off the island and away from the area. I'm sorry, the last thing I wanted to say about evacuation. Evacuation is designed to get people out of the storm surge zone. So if you live in League City or Friendswood or Pearland and you're going to get a big wind impact, generally you can survive that. You want to use situational awareness if you're inland from the coast. You don't want to ride out the hurricane under a 100-year-old oak tree, right? Go to your grandma's house or something. But generally the mandatory evacuation for whole areas, that's getting people out of the storm surge zone. And you mentioned Hurricane Rita in 2005. That was really an overreaction. People had seen what happened in New Orleans and Mississippi from Hurricane Katrina 3 weeks before. When Rita came our way, there was really hundreds of thousands of people hit the road. They were evacuating from places like Conroe and Katy and places that had no business evacuating. you had hundreds of, tens of thousands of people on the road blocking the evacuation, and it was taking people 11, 12 hours to get from here to Houston. A lot of people running out of gas. I believe 104 people died in the evacuation. The evacuation itself was catastrophic, and Rita actually curved and never even hit us. So people had a really bad experience in Rita. Since then, we have a more stepwise, organized, get people off Galveston Island and the coast first, and then maybe secondarily from these areas near the coast. But really, people inland really don't need to evacuate. They just need to use situational awareness. Yeah?
It sounded like there was pretty visceral opposition to those floating houses and stuff like that. What is the main interest, driving that opposition?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it seems to make sense, especially, say, our historic district. You could have buoyant foundations, and they're never going to flood. My understanding is FEMA had this idea that with buoyant foundations, the intention was to build brand new construction right next to rivers, right next to the Gulf Coast, right next to the Atlantic Ocean. And people involved with the buoyant foundation project said, no, that was never our intention to put more people in harm's way. What about the hundreds of thousands of homes or millions of homes that are already in vulnerable areas, but they're historic homes? Can we retrofit this? So I think there was a miscommunication. The last I heard, there is some communication about it, and that could be a proxy for all kinds of creative solutions. Mobile flood barriers, floating platforms for your car. I mean, we need to think more creatively. It's just, I scratch my head when I see, 100,000 cars lost, and you're like, well, you can move a car before a storm. Like, why can't we be more creative? I think the concern with FEMA, they thought we're going to put new construction in harm's way. That wasn't the intention. The intention was to retrofit what's already vulnerable. One last question, or everybody good? Yeah.
You'll have fun with this was meteorologist. I got obliterated by lightning on my office bike. Okay, and I was told by Texas windstorm that there were no tornadoes anywhere in Texas. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. And they said, no, there were wind vortices and mesocyclones. So they refused to cover me except for 5%. The lawsuit took care of that because, as the lawyer said, you get 12 regular jurors, you get somebody from windstorm saying mesocyclones and wind vortices, but there were no tornadoes.
Yeah, sometimes in the legal case it comes down to word choice and people are trying to be fancy with it. Yeah, I mean, essentially a mesovortice, it's a tight funnel that's essentially a tornado. Tornadoes are a controversial thing with hurricanes just because they're so small and surgical, but where you see the damage, it's noticeable. Great example, how many people were here 2 years ago when Hurricane Beryl came through? So, pretty decent windstorm, but, no one was really losing their houses until you went south of Jamaica Beach. There were some homes there. It looks like it took a Cat 5 hurricane, and this is where legitimate tornadoes came through. Where you have tornadoes generally far to the right of the eye, the damage, it's almost surgical, it's geographically small, but it really ramps up in a short amount of space. It can be a controversial thing. The National Weather Service usually does send field teams. It's something from a legal perspective, they'll put a lot of scientists on the ground to really understand what's happening, but unfortunately there are cases where insurance companies are trying to get out of payments and things like that. We do hear about that, and I think if you have a good team, if you have people of scientific credibility, usually they can see what's going on and get to it. Fortunately now we have more data than ever before, we have more storm chasers. I know when I go out and I'm documenting a storm, I'm thinking about litigation because afterwards it may be a question of, when did the floodwater come in? When did the wind start tearing off roofs? A lot of times it'll be a battle of wind versus water in court, and some of this stuff can drag out. So I hope you were made whole. It's a process in some cases, unfortunately, that it can take months to years to iron out these things after the fact. But great question. Thanks everyone again for coming out tonight. I know we talked a lot about hurricanes from different angles. I'd be happy to chat again a little bit afterwards. Hopefully this year we don't have any trouble, but if it is, maybe a climate guard waterproof bag or having cash on hand or something we talked about tonight will help you through it. Yeah, thanks for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it.